And Toby, I'm not going to steal your thunder by giving you a massive intro because you can do that yourself. So please take it away for us.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks. Hey, everyone. Lovely to see you this morning. Thanks ever so much for joining. I'm Toby. My pronouns are he, him. And for those that need a visual description of me, is that I'm a white man in my 40s. I'm sat in an electric-powered wheelchair that you might not be able to see because I've got a virtual background, which is actually hidden my wheelchair. I'm wearing a grey kind of speckly jumper. I've got a grey beard that matches and very little hair on the top of my head. So that's just a kind of visual description of me. I'll just share my screen as we go. And just bear with. Cool. So yeah, I'm going to be talking today about the intersection between sexuality, being a gay man myself, and also being disabled, and what my personal lived experience has been like, but also how that has informed my own leadership experiences and skills as I've worked in multiple different organizations. Feel free to ask me any questions as we go. You could just drop them in the chat if you want to, or you can just unmute yourself and speak to me. We also have, I've got a slide at the end where we've got time for me to take any questions if you want to leave them to the end as well. I'm happy with either. So I was born with a rare neuromuscular disability. It's called spinal muscular atrophy. There's only about 1,500 people in the UK living with this condition. It's a genetic condition. So both of my parents have what they call the defective gene. My parents got together to make me, and then there's a 1 in 4 chance that the child is born with the condition. And I was that 1 in 4 statistic that I was born with this neuromuscular condition, and it wasn't really picked up until I was about 12 to 18 months old. My parents noticed that I wasn't developing as they would expect any sort of 12 to 18-month-year-old develop. I wasn't able to sit up independently, and I could only get around by crawling backwards, not forwards. So they took me off to the doctors, and initially the doctors told my mum that she was just being a hypochondriac and that they should just take me home, let me develop in my own time, and everything would be fine. But things didn't develop as they would expect. So they went back for a second opinion. And then after having a muscle biopsy, I was diagnosed with having spinal muscular atrophy. And very little was known about the condition back then. So that was like 1981. The charity that was established that now represents those of us living with the disability wasn't established until 1985. And I grew up in the West Country near Glastonbury. Sometimes my accent slips out, certainly does after a couple of ciders. And the nearest doctors who were specialists in my condition were in London. So we would have regular trips to London to see the neurologists there. But I've been a wheelchair user all of my life, and pictured on the screen are some of the photos of when I was younger, lying on the floor with my dog, Penny, in one of my first electric wheelchairs, the blue wheelchair in the middle with a rabbit on my shoulder. And then something that I detested doing when I was a teenager was the physios would put me into a standing frame to try and stretch all of my muscles, which is pictured on the right. But I've always had a really strong work ethic. And when I was a teenager, all of my friends were going off getting work experience, and they were getting jobs that were kind of physical jobs, so working in supermarkets, stacking shelves. And I wanted to get into the world of work myself, but I knew that I wasn't able to do a physical job like working in a supermarket, putting stuff on shelves, that I would have to have a job that was probably desk-based or office-based. And actually, the careers advice that I got when I was a teenager was I could probably work in a factory peeling eggshells. And no disrespect to anyone that has worked in a factory peeling eggshells, but this just wasn't a career that I saw myself doing. I was always attracted to working for large brands, organizations. I wanted to move out of the West Country, and I always fancied moving to London and working in a big glass shiny tower in the city somewhere. And I got my first break actually when I was sort of 15, 16 years old, when I was at school, just about doing my GCSEs. And I went into my local branch of Lloyds Bank, and I kind of went in stealthily because I went in to open up a savings account, but I had an ulterior motive, which was to try and get myself a job. And at the end of the appointment, um, I met the bank manager to open up my savings account. He said to me, "Is there anything else I can help you with?" And I said, "Well, actually, there is. I'd quite like a job, please." And to my surprise, he said that I could go and work for Lloyds Bank. Now, the branch that he worked in was quite a small rural branch that wasn't very accessible. So he arranged for me to go and work in a bigger branch that was 20 minutes down the road in a larger town that was bigger and more accessible. And I ended up working for Lloyds Bank during my school, college, and university holidays for about 4 years. And having Lloyds Bank on my CV was a real stepping stone that helped me get some jobs for some bigger, well-known organizations here in the UK. But this experience was really profound because it was one of the first experience in hindsight where I found what we would term an inclusive manager these days. He could see that I had a physical disability, but he took a risk, and he acted as a sponsor and an ally, and he helped me get my foot on the career ladder for a really well-known and respected bank. Now, I've got a career of two halves because I went off to university and I got a degree in marketing. And then when I left university, I moved down to London and I started working in technology. So I was an IT consultant for Accenture. I then moved to another company called Cerner, which has recently been taken over by Oracle, which is a healthcare technology company. So I was a program manager implementing software into hospitals. And then I went to the BBC as a technical project manager, working on the BBC News website and developing the BBC Sounds app. And also I worked on numerous accessibility projects. I was working in the user experience and design team. And I was able to pivot my career because I'd been doing that for a number of years. And it just happened by accident. I was really good friends with, and I worked really closely with the chief operating officer. And he was concerned with the rest of the senior leadership team about the gender imbalance that we had within our technology and engineering department. So the BBC, roughly speaking, was kind of 50-50 gender split. But within our technology and engineering department, only 14% of our team identified as women. So the leadership team came up with a plan to attract and recruit more women into our technology and engineering roles, and they needed a project manager to execute the plan. So I volunteered to do it as a secondment for 6 months, and then it turned into a full-time job because I quickly realized, having just been introduced into the world of diversity and inclusion, that diversity and inclusion was much more broader than focusing on one particular characteristic or group of people. So I persuaded the team to turn my secondment into a full-time job where we could expand the scope to look at multiple aspects of difference and identity, and to really focus on creating a culture of inclusion. Now, I've been at the BBC for 10 years, and I don't know if Claire would agree with me on this, but a friend of mine who is a leadership consultant herself said to me, if you stay in an organization for 10 years, then you officially are considered institutionalized. I don't know if that was good advice or not, but it scared the crap out of me. So I decided to leave the BBC, and I wanted to get back into the corporate sector because the business case, if you like, for diversity and inclusion at the BBC is really quite straightforward. I mean, it's written into the Royal Charter, but the BBC is a public service organisation, and it has a duty to make sure that everybody across the UK sees themselves reflected in the content that the BBC produces, whether that's on TV, on radio, or online. And I was really intrigued as to why one of the big four accountancy firms was so invested in diversity and inclusion. And particularly, they talked about creating a culture of respect and inclusion. They didn't really use the word diversity, it was called respect and inclusion. And it was a lot more around changing culture in the organization. So I went to go and find out. And then I realized that I wanted to just do my own thing. I wanted the freedom to work with different organizations. I had a few creative projects up my sleeve, like writing a book. So I've written 2 books, launching a podcast, and things like that. So I left to do it under my own name. But what I learned in terms of my own personal leadership journey is that as a queer disabled person myself, we have to kind of redefine success on our own terms. What I learned is that actually my career didn't go in a straight line. When I left university and I joined Accenture, I thought I would have a nice linear career path, but I've actually had a squiggly career. I've taken lots of different twists and turns. And one of the most instrumental books that I read was when I was working in user experience and design, was around pivoting. Introduced me to this kind of notion of pivoting. And pivoting is this kind of method where you're working on developing something. Let's say you're working on developing a brand new website, and that website isn't quite getting traction. You're not getting the visitors that you were expecting. You're not getting the number of people clicking on the buttons that you want to click on. So rather than kind of just throw out the old design, you do a pivot. And what that means is effectively you keep one foot in the original design and you create another design next to it, which you put your other foot into, and you test them side by side. And then you compare them and you decide which is the higher performing design. And then you switch to the higher performing design. And it got me thinking about applying that to my own sort of leadership and career development. And that's what I did in a way at the BBC in terms of having a secondment. I had to twist a few arms for them to create the secondment. It wasn't something that was just made readily available, but it was my way of pivoting my career, of saying, let me put my project management career path on hold for now. Let me test out working as a diversity and inclusion practitioner for 6 to 12 months. And then at the end of that, I could decide if I wanted to switch paths. And that's what I did. And that's what I would term pivoting. And on my podcast, actually, I interviewed somebody recently who's a career coach that talks about pivoting. So it's worth checking that recent episode out. But what I learned is that success in our careers doesn't necessarily mean getting an official title or going after multiple promotions and working your way up to the top of the pyramid. That I was able to have a successful career in those organizations in different other ways. So my kind of extracurricular activities, where I was the chairperson of the disabled staff network at the BBC, and our job was to reflect the careers and of disabled people in the BBC and how disabled people were portrayed in the media. So that brought me lots of influence, because I would kind of network and connect with really senior people, including like the Director General of the BBC, in order to influence change within the BBC. I took on mentoring roles. I was mentored, so we can measure success in lots of different ways. And the thing is, if we ourselves feel like we're different, so if you have a disability or you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, sometimes other people have a fixed notion of what success looks like. It often tends to be kind of like a heteronormative view on what success looks like, or an ableist view of what success looks like. And if you are queer and disabled, it might mean that you just have to define success on your own terms. Now, whenever I do trainings around diversity and inclusion, I like to use um, this pyramid metaphor that diversity is so broad, and we can see a lot of diversity above the waterline, our visible characteristics. So that could be your race or ethnicity, it could be the way that you present your gender, it could be if you have a physical disability like myself. But actually, there's so much hidden beneath the waterline. Like 80% of the iceberg is hidden beneath the waterline that makes us unique and different. And these tend to be our kind of less apparent or invisible differences. So it could be whether you are introvert or extrovert, whether you grew up in the countryside or in the city centre, whether you certain aspects of being part of the LGBTQ plus community you can hide from the view if you want to. And this is what I had growing up. I grew up with a visible aspect of myself in terms of it was really obvious that I had a physical disability because I'm in a powered wheelchair that weighs 110 kilograms. But also there was another side to me that I could easily hide, and that was being a gay man. And it was something that I felt growing up that always took a bit of a back seat. So growing up, I had lots of kind of healthcare interventions like surgery, physio, things like that. And when you go through the healthcare system, they don't actually pay a lot of attention to other aspects of your life. It's all very medical based. And I can count on one hand, less than one hand, the number of conversations that I've had with medical practitioners about my sexuality or about romance, for example. Because you are, first and foremost, I was seen as a kind of medical patient with a physical disability that need seeing to. And so naturally, my sexuality um, kind of took a bit of a backseat. And I didn't come out until I was 29 years old. And that was after having quite a lot of psychotherapy and a near death experience, having got pneumonia and spending 2 months in a coma in intensive care. And when I came out of that experience, I was like, I need to live more of an authentic life. I can't keep suppressing a part of me that's actually really important in terms of who I'm romantically attracted to or who I want to have a relationship with. And I was just telling myself a lie. so so I decided to try and make the invisible more visible. And representation tells us who belongs and who matters. And this was a sentence that really stood out for me from a report that was written by a professor at Westminster University in conjunction with an engineering consultancy called Arup, who do a lot around inclusive design. And their report, their collaboration report, was called Queering Public Spaces. And it was all about how do you make the built environment or public spaces accessible and inclusive for members of the LGBT plus community. But as I read the report, I just kept thinking to myself, they could as well have also been talking about how do you make public spaces accessible for disabled people in terms of their findings and recommendations. And when we look at the intersectionality of the built environment, for example, if we take Canal Street, which is what they use, this is not my term, but this is the term that they use in the report. They call it, the gayborhood of Manchester. Soho is the gayborhood of London. But if we take Canal Street, for example, next time you walk down Canal Street, just have a look at how many of the venues have got step-free access into them. You can count on one hand the number of venues that don't have steps. So what that tells you, if you are a wheelchair user and you're part of the LGBTQ plus community, is that Canal Street, which is supposed to be a welcoming and safe space for people in the LGBTQ plus community, isn't necessarily welcoming and accessible if you are going around on wheels. So representation tells us who belongs and who matters. And on the screen, I've got some photos that I've taken. So on the left-hand side, there's a photo of me next to the bronze statue of Franklin D. Roosevelt at his memorial in Washington, D.C. And I went on holiday with my boyfriend to Washington, D.C. for a wedding. And we were just walking around and we kind of stumbled across the FDR memorial, and there's the statue of FDR sat in a wheelchair. And it was a really moving experience for me because it's the only statue that I've seen of somebody in a wheelchair. And I kind of had a photo with him because it's something that you rarely see. I felt like I had been represented at the higher powers of politics in US politics, for example. And also it's something that they wanted to show the world, because FDR actually went to great lengths to hide that he actually had a disability from the world because of how he was worried how people would perceive him. In the middle, we got a photo of the Alan Turing statue in Manchester. And then on the right-hand side is a photo of me outside the door of number 10 Downing Street. And I went along to um, a charity event at 10 Downing Street. And if you notice, there's steps up to 10 Downing Street. And they've said for numerous years that it's not possible to make the entrance to 10 Downing Street step free because the building is listed. Yet St. Paul's Cathedral has just managed to very recently make the front entrance up to the cathedral step free. And as a disabled person, you no longer need to go through a separate side entrance. But what that's telling you is if you're growing up with a disability and you're watching 10 Downing Street on TV, it's telling you on this subliminal level that there's a barrier to high politics, that this isn't necessarily a place where you belong if you've got aspirations of becoming the Prime Minister in the future. Now, I've mentioned the word intersectionality, and intersectionality is basically where two identities kind of clash, if you like, and where you might get additional barriers or additional prejudice created as a consequence of these two identities clashing with one another or meeting in the middle. So here I'm going to be talking about the intersectionality of being part of the LGBTQ plus community, my personal experience of identifying as a gay man, but also having a physical disability. And there's been numerous times over my life where I felt the two merging. And there was an event, there was a kind of situation a couple of years ago when I first moved to Manchester from London with my boyfriend. I went along to this networking event in Manchester. I thought it'd be a great opportunity to meet new people locally. And it was an awards evening to celebrate accessibility within the hospitality industry. And as I entered the event, one of the co-hosts introduced me to this guy in a manual wheelchair who had been shortlisted for an award. And she introduced him as such as please, can I introduce you to so and so? He's a influencer on TikTok and part of the LBT or whatever they call it these days community. And I said to her, it's LGBT, and it just seemed to kind of not register. I challenged her in the moment, and I could visibly see this kind of awkwardness in the other guy. I don't want to name him, but the other guy's face and how he felt uncomfortable. And he was also new to the country as well. So I think there was an element of, so he was a kind of overseas student doing a master's degree over here. So he felt a bit uncomfortable as well. And I certainly felt uncomfortable. So I thought, okay, right, let's move on and see what happens. And then as she was introducing him to the stage to collect his award, she made the same quote unquote joke again. So she was like, oh, can I introduce so and so to the stage? He's a TikTok influencer and a member of the LBT or whatever they call themselves these days. And I just thought, this is not a funny joke. And this is a good example of where the disability and the LGBT intersections clashed with one another. On the same evening, her co-host also made a transphobic remark. As he opened up the evening, he said, oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, hang on a minute. If we were British Airways, I wouldn't be able to call you ladies and gentlemen, would I? And I just thought, this is just this is not an appropriate quote unquote joke to be making. So I actually got quite angry about it. And I went home to my boyfriend that evening and I ranted about it. And I decided to write my experience up as into a LinkedIn article. And I anonymized everybody. And I actually sent it to the organizers. And I said, look, this happened on the night. I wasn't the only person to feel uncomfortable about this as a queer disabled person. On one hand, you tried to create an inclusive event for disabled people, but on the other hand, you didn't make it inclusive because you were making homophobic and transphobic quote unquote jokes on the evening. And actually, you tried serving pork to my carer who's Muslim as well. So it's like you say it was an inclusive event, but it wasn't inclusive because you weren't thinking about the intersectionality. You weren't thinking about disabled people being part of an LGBTQ community or having a religion or a faith, for example, and accommodating that in your food. So I wrote the article and they said, no, we want to be named. We've got nothing to be ashamed of. And so I was like, okay, then. To cut a long story short, I published the article on LinkedIn. The shit hit the fan. They bullied me and the person who they made the joke into to try and take it down offline. It got picked up by the Disability News Service, which is it's a online newspaper for disability related news, and very often stories get picked up by the national press from that website as well. So that's just an example of kind of how the intersectionality of disability and LGBT can kind of meet. And what we know about disability, the intersection of disability and LGBT, is that if you are a queer disabled person, you're going to be more likely on the receiving end of double discrimination from both a disability and an LGBT perspective. There'll be significant less representation. There are very few authentic, genuine queer disabled people in TV, media, and film. And also a lot of LGBTQ plus spaces are just not very accessible if you have accessibility needs. One of the most informative books that I read when I was coming out, when I was 29, 30 years old, was The Velvet Rage by Alan Downs, who's a psychologist in America. An amazing book. I'd highly recommend it, reading it, even if you aren't a member of the LGBTQ plus community yourself. If you're an ally of the community, then it's definitely a book worth reading. But what Alan Down talks about is that if you grow up as a gay man, he talks specifically about growing up as a gay man, and you start to notice that you feel different to other people, you start to develop these unhealthy coping mechanisms or habits. And so he talks about things like hiding. You hide your true self or your true identity, and you downplay certain aspects of yourself. You tend to overcompensate. So for me, that has resulted in me being a workaholic, me having to kind of prove to the world that actually I'm just as good as anybody else as a gay man, but also as a disabled person, and then going out and seeking validation to prove my worth. And so these can become, when you develop these coping mechanisms in early years, you develop them to help protect yourself, and they play an important role in keeping you safe. But as you grow up, you kind of grow out of these coping mechanisms, and they become more problematic, and they result in sort of problematic behaviors rather than keeping you safe. But every time Alan Downs talked about gay men or gay man in the book, I thought I could easily substitute it as a disabled man, because everything he was talking to was just as relevant to me growing up with a disability as it was growing up as a gay man. Now, we've got a number of inequalities in society that creates barriers for disabled people. We know that, for example, disabled people tend to have fewer qualifications. Therefore, they are in lower skilled, lower paid roles. Disabled people find it harder to access training and development opportunities. Disabled people often report less job satisfaction or autonomy over their roles. And it's certainly backed up by the data with our own clients. I do lots of EDI surveys, and we've got this amazing question where we say, how much influence do you feel like you've got over your team? And what we consistently see is that disabled people and people who are experiencing mental health challenges consistently tell us that they feel that they don't have as much influence over decision making in their roles or their team compared to non-disabled people. And we also see a higher proportion of disabled people in part-time roles. And my theory here is that a lot of employers are not being flexible in accommodating disabled people. So disabled people might opt for a part-time job because it maybe gives them that flexibility. But a really worrying statistic came out of Scope, the national disability charity, that says that 45% of working age disabled adults say that they're chronically lonely. And that really worries me because work plays such an important role in terms of our health and well-being. It gives us a reason to wake up in the morning. It puts money in our pockets so that we can make independent choices and live independent lives. It gives us social connections, and it gives us a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. So work is really important to our health and well-being. And if disabled people are feeling chronically lonely, I think that's a really worrying sign for society at large. Now, within disability, there's two main two schools of thoughts, and there's a couple of others that I'm not going to go through today. But when we look at disability, we talk about two different models. The first model, which is the medical model, which is sometimes called the individualistic or the deficit model, was really popularized around the time of the Industrial Revolution, particularly when we started to see a movement of people moving from cottage industries into cities and working in industry and industry and factories. And the medical model basically says that somebody's disabled because there's something wrong with you, that there needs to be some sort of intervention or you need to be fixed somehow. And the reason why I like using individualistic or deficit model is because the deficit is suggesting that there's something lacking here, or the individualistic model is saying, well, there's something wrong with the individual. The medical model doesn't necessarily mean to say that there has to be a medical intervention like surgery. It's just the term that they use in terms of it's basically saying that there's something wrong with the person, that person has to be fixed. What was then developed around the 80s and certainly popularized in the 90s when the Disability Discrimination Act was introduced in 1995, which has since been superseded by the Equality Act in 2010, is the social model. And the social model basically says that people are disabled because of the barriers that are created in society. So those could be physical barriers, they could be attitudinal barriers, they could be policy-based barriers or procedural-based barriers. So if I want to go out for dinner this evening with my boyfriend, and I can't get into the restaurant because there's steps and there's no lift or no ramp, it's not the fact that I have an underlying neurological disability, or that I'm a wheelchair user that's the problem. The problem is the fact that the restaurant doesn't have a lift or a ramp to get into. Or if I do go into the restaurant and the waiter talks over me and talks to my partner about what I want to eat for dinner, or if I want a drink or not, which happens quite significantly, or they assume that my partner is my carer and they treat him as kind of my carer rather than as a significant other. That's more of a kind of attitudinal barrier that we often have to navigate. So the focus in terms of how do we make workplaces accessible is thinking about, okay, what barriers exist and how do we remove them? And the golden question that I love or like managers to ask is, what is slowing you down or stopping you from achieving XYZ goal? Because with that question, you're identifying the speed humps and roadblocks that are either slowing people down or preventing them from completing something. And here we need to just draw the distinction between equality and equity. And you might have seen this image floating around the internet. It's quite popular. But this image shows equality on the left-hand side. You've got three characters who are trying to look over a fence to watch a game of football. And they've all been given the same size box to stand on. And this is equality. This is about treating everybody the same, giving everybody the same resources. But the thing is, we don't operate on a level playing field. We need to be seen as individuals and we need to be given the individual's support and resources to enable us to thrive. So in this instance, the wheelchair user on the left-hand side can't see over the fence because they can't get their box on top of the they can't get their wheelchair on top of the box. Equity, however, is illustrated on the right-hand side, and this is about seeing the individuals for who they really are, what their starting point is, and trying to give them the individualized resources and support they need in order to thrive. So in this instance, the character in the middle's got 2 boxes to stand on. The character on the left doesn't need a box because they're already tall enough. And then the character on the right in the wheelchair has now got a ramp to get up to the top and start watching the game of football. Now, one of my favorite quotes is from Michael Jordan, and he says that talent wins games, but teams win championships. And so when we're thinking about individual talent, how can we actually bring teams together so that you are kind of thriving as a team? One of my favorite models around high performing teams is that was created by Patrick Lencioni, which is the 5 dysfunctions of a team. I'm not going to go through the whole model, and Claire is the leadership expert here, so she could probably talk to you about this in a future session. But the reason why I like using this in conjunction with sort of disability inclusion and LGBT inclusion is, first of all, looking at the bottom, which is around creating psychological safety and building trust within your team. If you don't have this foundational level of trust, then you get this guardedness and people can't be open with one another. So from a disability and LGBT perspective, if I've got a hidden disability, am I able to feel like I can ask my manager for support or adjustments without any fear of backlash on my role? Or do I keep it hidden that, for example, I'm dyslexic and that I find it difficult reading reports before meetings? Has the manager created that kind of environment that enables people to come forwards? Again, from an LGBT perspective, can I go to work and talk openly about what I did at the weekend with my same-sex partner without worrying about people coming up with inappropriate jokes or inappropriate assumptions or stereotypes in the process? So culturally, as a team, do we have that trust where we can be open? And then the next level up is what Patrick Lencioni talks about in terms of avoiding conflict. And this, if you don't have healthy conflict, if you don't have radical candor, as Kim Scott puts it in her own book, Radical Candor, then you start to build up resentment in your team. So how can you create an environment where you can have this candidness with one another? And from a disabilities perspective, what that means is that I've worked in teams where teams have felt like they can ask me questions about my disability, and I've been able to be quite candid with them, and I haven't had to worry about any kind of negative consequences of giving direct feedback or them giving me direct feedback. Quite often, actually, disabled people don't receive the same type of feedback that non-disabled colleagues get, because people are worried about giving me feedback because they're worried that I might take it the wrong way, or that they're being unfair somehow. And so actually disabled people miss out on those feedback opportunities because feedback is often withheld. In other words, because they want to avoid that conflict, they're not being forthcoming in giving feedback. Now, if you are interested in kind of developing your inclusive leadership behaviors, again, Claire's the expert on the call today in terms of leadership. But a model that I like to use with my clients was developed by a team of occupational psychologists at a company called Talergy, who do lots of different assessments throughout the whole employee life cycle. And with a project that they did with a police force, they came up with 6 really important behaviors in terms of inclusive leadership. So the first one is about empathy, which is about understanding and showing sensitivity towards other people's perspectives of views and concerns, regardless of their background and context. Relationship building is all about building effective relationships with people from different and wide variety of different backgrounds to establish rapport and trust. Learning orientation is all about seeking to learn and develop, taking steps to build knowledge about the world around you, and you're open to new experiences and information. Open-mindedness is all about being tolerant and non-judgmental when dealing with others, avoiding assumptions and preconceptions, treating each individual and situation separately. Composure is all about managing your emotions in times of challenge and when you're working under pressure, remaining appropriately calm, composed, and in control of your responses. Otherwise, people feel like they're kind of walking on eggshells around you. And then finally, flexibility is all about adapting your approach, style, and behavior depending on individuals that you're interacting with and identifying solutions based on their specific needs and their specific situation. So when we look at it from a disability perspective, what that means is rather than making assumptions about what I can and can't do as a disabled person, be more empathic by asking me some nice open-ended coaching questions like, when it comes to this particular task, what can you do? What can't you do? What might you need help with? Relationship building, come and have a conversation with me in the first place. Don't avoid having a conversation with me because you feel awkward around talking to a disabled person. With learning orientation, it might be read up about disability, listen to a podcast, read an article on LinkedIn that's written by a disabled person in the workplace, just to expand your awareness. For composure, if something goes wrong, don't try and keep calm. Don't let the situation ruffle your feathers too much. And with flexibility, understand that disabled people are very adept at getting things done because they live with their disability. They've learned how to navigate life, like just doing everyday things like getting to and from work on public transport or going to the shops to buy things. Disabled people have learned lots of skills to achieve their goals. And so we bring this flexibility into the way that we work as well. So that needs to be accepted and accomplished. Now, when we talk about empathy, I really like to use the LEAP framework, which I find quite useful. And what the LEAP framework says is, first of all, listen on all levels. So don't listen just to the words that I'm saying. Listen to how I'm saying it. Listen to what I'm not saying. Listen to the silences. And also listen to my body language and the way that I express myself. So kind of have that holistic listening, active listening skill. Then rather than jumping into making assumptions or presumptions, start to inquire by asking nice open-ended coaching-like questions. So you could say, tell me more about that, or explain to me further, or describe to me that situation. Then acknowledge that you've heard. Say, this is what I understood that you've said, kind of play it back to people. And then that way, as a disabled person, I feel like I've been heard, I've been understood, and it validates my experience. And then with permission, you can propose. So you could say, is it okay? I've got some ideas on how I think I might be able to support you with this. Do you mind if I share those with you? So this LEAP framework is a nice framework that you can use if you're having kind of one-to-one conversations. Now, in terms of sort of practical things that you could do as an ally of the LGBTQ community, so LGBTQ plus community, first of all, signal. So signal your support that you support the community, and that could be using pronouns when you introduce yourself in a meeting, like I did today, or having your pronouns on your email signature. Wearing a lanyard if you work in an organization that's got an LGBT network, and they're giving out lanyards or pride lanyards, then wear those lanyards. So these are the small signals that let people know that you are an ally and that you're a supporter. Use the power of your voice. So if you notice bias going on, call it out in meetings. If you notice people making homophobic, transphobic, queerphobic, ableist remarks, call it out in a way that you feel comfortable doing it. Thirdly, make space for people. If you notice that somebody can't get their voice heard, just say, oh, hang on a second. I think Matt has got a point. Sorry to pick on you, Matt, but I think Matt is trying to make a point. Matt, go ahead. What are your thoughts or feelings on this? So you're creating that space for other people. And then the final one is really challenge the systems. It's often the systems that get in our way. It's those speed humps and roadblocks that get in people's way. So if you notice a process or a system in your organization that is creating a barrier, call it out and ask people to start breaking those barriers down. So if you think your recruitment process is putting up barriers to disabled people applying, go through your recruitment process, name and identify those barriers, and try and eliminate those barriers as much as possible. So thanks ever so much for listening to me for the last 50 minutes. And I'm very happy to take any questions that you've got.
Thank you so much, Toby. That was amazing. We haven't actually had any questions in the chat, so I'm hoping that people might raise their voices here. Steph, you've appeared on the screen,
Hi.
hopefully to talk to us.
Yeah, I really, that was an amazing talk and yeah, very moving and also super useful tips. I was wondering if there was like a moment for you where you sort of found your voice with your journey being LGBT and disabled, if there was like a something that really um sort of propelled you forward, or like a moment for you that was super meaningful.
Yeah, for me, the turning point was when I had that when I got pneumonia and I was in a coma for 2 months and I came out of hospital, and I just had this personal realization that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life hiding a big part of myself. Um, and so I I was already in psychotherapy um,
Mm.
anyway, because my dad's got some really quite severe mental health problems, and I kind of had this personal realization that I was in a very fortunate and very privileged position, that I had good mental health, and that also I was in a well-paying job, and that I decided to invest in my own psyche and my own mental health. So I was already on that path, but I came across, I don't know how I came across him, but basically I got myself a gay coach. His name is Darren Brady, down in London. Can't remember the name of his little organization that he, with his business partner. I can't remember now, but basically I got coaching with him, and he was such a turning point in me um, coming being able to accept my sexuality and living an authentic life as a gay man.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you. I feel like that's the signal for me to get on the mentor thing. Yeah, thank you
Yeah,
for that.
honestly, mentoring, coaching, therapists. Um, the way that I approach this is like, you want to keep your body fit. So you go to the gym and you do exercises. So you want to keep your mind fit. So why wouldn't you go and get a therapist or a coach or a mentor? So that's the way I look at it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to suggest. And the mentoring platform, thank you for giving that another plug for us, Steph. Are there any more questions that people would like to ask? Because otherwise I will let you go. Matt, did you have any thoughts that you'd like to bring in?
Yeah, I mean, another plug for the Velvet Rage. It's my bookcase behind me, and yeah, is was a really sort of key book for me as well. But yeah, I kind of wondered about that point about intersectionality, and found it really interesting that that kind of holding together of an identity that you couldn't actually hide in most circumstances, and actually an identity that you could. And I guess you're one of the few people that have actually experienced this sort of the both of those types of identities together, a kind of a masked identity and an unmasked one. I
Mm.
wonder if you had any thoughts or reflections about the contrast or the similarities between those two identities.
Yeah. The thing is, I knew that I was gay from a very young age, but I did a very good job of hiding it, um, and keeping it hidden, um, and that took a lot of effort. I would say that when we look at intersectionality, um, there were times when I would say I received more barriers because I had both identities. So, for example, if I worked in an organization and as a queer person, I really wanted to go along to the event that the LGBT network organized, but they organized it in the upstairs of a pub with no lifts. then I couldn't go because of my physical disability. And that then just is very jarring, because it's like half of me wants to go because I'm an LGBT person, but then the other half of me is like, I can't go because I can't get up the stairs. So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah, and it's a constant challenge for people working in diversity and inclusion. And in it, Steph, I know that you work in diversity and inclusion. You're trying to focus on one element, and you can't actually. You need to constantly be thinking of all the different intersections that could be affected by decisions like that feel like quite trivial decisions.
Yeah.
You know, where to put something on doesn't feel that big a deal unless it
Yeah.
affects you. And then
Yeah.
it's really, really impactful.
I think it's a mindset thing. If you are a manager or a leader, it's thinking about the person in front of you is not just one thing. They are not just a gender. They are not just a parent or non-parent. They're not just a disabled person or non-disabled person. You've got multiple characteristics and identities, and you have to, if we go back to those 6 inclusive leadership behaviors, empathy is probably, I would say, the most important one. And for me, empathy is about creating the space to really understand other people and where they're coming from. So suspend judgments, suspend assumptions or presumptions, or suspend stereotypes, and see the person in front of you as a holistic individual, and really try to get to understand the individual and what unique barriers or obstacles they personally face. And then you, as a sponsor, ally, can try and start to strip away those barriers that they might face.
Amazing. What a good call to action for us to finish on. Thank you so much, Toby.